Today I'm gonna go over all the rare cards from Ravnica Allegiance and highlight the good ones from the bad ones. Now obviously this is more towards new players to Magic who might not follow the pro scene or might not know what is actually a good card or what is actually a mediocre card. Anyway, I'll try to go somewhat fast. I'm not gonna go like which card fits into which deck, or we would be here forever. So I'm gonna try to keep it somewhat short. I might stop here and there to highlight specific cards, but overall I want this video to be like, I want it to be under, let's say, 15 minutes. Let's see if I can do that. Alright, so let's start with Hero of Prescient 1. Now, obviously this card is a really good card. It's good in mono white. You can go with white blue as well, which has become a bit more popular, but overall the card is playable, and if you're playing creatures and you like playing, well, white with your creatures, then this is definitely a card you should own. City Taker is another card you should own if you're playing white. Now you should not own like a playset, but a couple of them, like 2 to 3 is usually a good number. The card is obviously really good against things like drakes, and having Afterlife 1 really helps it out, especially when you're trying to hit that City's Blessing in a very aggressive white/blue deck, which is like the most popular deck with the City Taker at the moment. Let's move on to Unbreakable Formation. At release, this didn't really see much play, but in the recent weeks, this has actually been a card that has seen a bit of play, although usually as a 1 or as a 2 off. Now let's move on to a card that is kinda baddish, and that is the Smothering. Now this card is obviously a bit too slow, 4 mana for your opponent to pay 2 mana for you to not create a colorless treasure that gives you 1 mana. It's just way too slow, and you really shouldn't own this card. Like, unless you want to do something funky or something fun, this is not a card that is like playable in Constructed. Let's move on to another card that is not really playable in Constructed, and that is the Lumbering Battlement. Now this card is one of those cards that is amazing in draft or limited format, but in Constructed it is obviously way too expensive and doesn't really do too much. I hate when they do things like this, because this card could be useful in Standard if it had either Trample or if it had Flash. Then it could be a really good card, and it could be a skillful card that the opponent had to play around, because if he did everything in the wrong order, you could just flash this in and save your minions. But that is not the case, and instead we are left with a draft-only creature. Let's move on to the first blue card, which is gonna be the Biomancer. Now, Adapt is not really working as an archetype. Yes, you can make it work, but it's not a tournament-ready deck, like if you go full Adapt. Obviously, there are a few Adapt creatures that are really good, but they don't really work as a tribe at the moment. Now, obviously, if you play Merfolk, this could be a card you want to include. And, well, if you're making some fun Adapt deck, this is obviously a card you also want to include. But if you're trying to make like a standard meta deck that wants to compete with other tier 1 decks, then this is a card you can safely skip. Let's move on to the Circle. Well, there's not much to say about this. This is just another limited card, really. I doubt this will ever really see Constructed play. It's just no. Let's move on to something a bit more, maybe not, and that is the Sphinx of Foresight. Now, I like the Sphinx. I think it has potential. The problem is it kinda competes with Drakes in that 4 mana slot, but what it does is very powerful. I actually ran 2 Sphinxes in my mono blue before I got all 4 of my, what they call Tempest Gin, just because I needed to fill out the deck, and it was actually surprisingly good when I actually had it in my opening hand. Like, a mono blue deck really wants a good hand, Curse Obsession, and wants the right draw, and the Sphinx of Foresight was able to actually correct my draw step if I had it in the opening hand, but it was good when I had it in the opening hand, but it wasn't very good when I had to cast it later in the game. But I'm not sure. This is a card you might want to keep an eye on, but it's not a card that's like required to craft. Let's move on to the Perception thingy. Now, a bit expensive. It's actually really expensive. 5 mana to draw 3 cards, or if you do the what is it called, addendum thingy, then you get to scry 3. But this is too expensive to really run in a proper control deck, and at the time you can actually safely cast this, you're probably already won the game or already locked down the board with Teferi that you won't need this card. So this is another card you can safely skip. Let's move on to Mass Manipulation. Now this card is good. It has seen tournament play, and it is a card that you can own this card, just not too many copies, but it does require a very blue deck because it does have that 4 mana cost of blue plus X. But yeah, there's nothing bad to say about this card, it's actually a really good card. Let's move on to a card that is not very good, and that is the font. It's way too slow, and well, paying 2 to remove 4 counters just to destroy a creature, it's just too slow, it can't really work. Gutter Bones, however, is a card that can work. I've seen this in some lists on MTG online rankings, and it seems to be working fine. Now, luckily enough, you can only return him to your hand if you have damaged your opponent and only on your turn. There is that other skeleton where you can just keep resurrecting it forever, and it seems like they want to move away from that. So that's quite a good thing, but overall, if you want a black creature, then this is a creature you can certainly be happy owning. Now the Priest of Forgotten Gods, this is a card you probably won't be too happy owning, a bit too slow, you need to sacrifice 2 creatures to target any number of players, and they each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature, and you get to draw a card and get some mana, but this is like limited, maybe, but in Constructed, I don't see this having a future at all. So let's move to another card that is probably never gonna see stand-up play either, and that is the Pestilent Spirit. It is an interesting card, it gives all your instant and sorcery cards Death Touch, but 3 mana to give your Bolt or your Shock a Death Touch ability, I mean, no. If this was like a 1/1 and cost 1 mana, sure, this would definitely see play, but as a 3 cost, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit aggressive deck, and it doesn't fit mid-range deck because you want to, play powerful stuff like Drakes. You want to play your, what are they called? The Hellspawn. You want to play Chain Whirlers at 3 mana, so like, why would you play this? This is another card, well, limited, yes. Constructed, no. I'm not going to waste any more time on it, so let's move on. And we're going to move on to another card we can pretty much skip. This card, limited, for fun, but standard, no. Just no. Anyway, let's move on to the first red card, and that is the Immolation Shaman. Sadly, the effect isn't too relevant in standard at the moment, so this is another card that you can safely skip. Now, Rix is a card you definitely do not want to skip if you're gonna play creatures and if you're gonna play red and black. The card is really amazing. When you pay the spectate cost, you dump your hand and you draw 3 new cards, but obviously you probably will, if you're playing mid-range or if you're playing aggro, you won't really have a hand, so you get to refill your hand for the cost of 4 mana, and you're not playing blue, and you get a creature on the board. It's a really strong card. So this is definitely one of those you can safely own 4 copies of. Amplifier is a card that you do not want to own 4 copies of though. This is way too expensive, it's a 1/1 hit dice to anything, it's mainly just a bit of fun. The same can be said about Mirror Match, another just fun card / limited. I mean, it's not really a limited card either, it's just a fun card to have a bit of fun with. Electro Dominance, on the other hand, is a card that is actually really good and is playable. However, it hasn't seen too much play in top 1 decks or tier 1 decks at the moment, but it is a card that can be useful if you're playing MTG Online or MTG Arena. Maybe not so much if you went to a tournament, you wouldn't really bring a deck with it, but the card is not bad. It's not a Pestilent Spirit and it's not a Forgotten God. The card is playable, probably not as a 4-off, but it is a card you will not be unhappy owning, unless you hate playing anything red. Anyway, we are now done with red and let's move on to green. So we're gonna start with the Growth Chamber Guardian. Yes, this card is amazing. If you like playing green and creatures, you should definitely own 4 copies of this card. I mean, what can I more say about this card? It is amazing. The adapt function is really good on this card. When you adapt, you get another Growth Chamber Guardian from your deck, assuming you still have one in the deck, and you buff your creature. So not only do you draw a deck, you also thin your deck, and you buff your current creature. This is just all around a really good card. And there's no, I can't say anything else about it. It's really good. You should probably own it if you like playing green. And on the plus side, it's also an elf. So if you want to make an elf tribe deck for fun, this one fits right in it. Moving on to the Incubation Druid. This druid is good as a one-off, maybe as a two-off. You probably, in the current standard, don't want to own a playset, but there are quite a few number of, not Golgaria, but Sultai decks that are including a copy of 2 of the Incubation Druid. But this is probably not a card it's not a card that you need to play Sultai, it's just a card that is nice to have. And that's all the praise you can give the Incubation Druid. It's not a bad card, it's just not a card that you need right now in order to play your tier 1 Sultai deck. Now a card like Guardian Project, on the other hand, is a card you can safely skip, and that is what we're gonna do. It is, I mean, if you want to have a bit of fun, sure, but if you're looking for tier 1, stay away from this card. The same can be said about Rampage of the Clans. Now, destroying all artifact and enchantments sounds good, however, they also get a 3/3 creature, so I don't know. I don't see it at a rare level, I see it at an uncommon at best. Next up we have a cool looking boar. Sadly, this is another one of those way too expensive, 8 mana. It doesn't have any protection, so you know, anything kills it. Well, Raska's Contempt, Murder, Wrath, anything just no. Limited, sure, it's a bomb. In Constructed, why would you ever play this? Let's move on to the multicolored cards, and we're gonna start with the Renegade. Sadly, at the moment the Renegade is not that useful in Standard, and there's not much point of talking about other formats when it comes to the Renegade, because we only have Standard in MTG Arena. So let's move on to Warrant and Warden. This card is actually decent, but you probably only want a couple of them in a deck. It has seen play in control decks, obviously, and that's all the praise I can give it. It's a card still being explored. A card that is not being explored but is really good is Absorb. Now, I don't know what to say about this. You counter a spell and you gain 3 life. It's an amazing card, and of course it is rare just to annoy people, and if you're gonna play control, you probably want to own a couple of these cards. I don't know, it's a control card. What else is there to say about it? It's good. Let's move on to a really interesting card and a really good card, which is the Deputy of Detention. This is basically Exile on legs, which is wonderful. This card has mainly seen play in, well, I was gonna say mono white, but it's now mono white with some blue attachments. However, Deputy of Detention tends to be like a 1 to 2 off card in a mono white deck, and in the sideboard they tend to cram in some counter spells to help the deck perform better in best of 3s. Now obviously if you play best of 1s, then Deputy of Detention is not a card that you want to include into your mono white deck solely for having him. I mean, that would be really wasteful. You would have to spend so many wildcards just to include 1 to 2 Deputy of Detention. But if you're playing best of 3s, this is definitely a card that you want to include into your mono white / white blue deck. Let's move on to Dovin's Dismissal, and we go to next card. That card is just no. We're gonna move on to Revival and Revenge. This card is actually playable, but this is another one of those cards that is a one-off, maybe 2-off, but probably a one-off, and in a control deck more or less. I mean, there's not much to say about it. It is functional. It's not a requirement for a deck, but it's not a card that you will be unhappy owning a single or maybe 2 copies of. But that's about it. A card that you do want to own a playset of, however, is the Wrath card, or the new Wrath card. I wonder how many Wrath cards do we have now? We have Wrath, we have Tempest, I'm not going to go over it, we have quite a few. And this one is obviously really good, like all the other Wrath cards. It's also on 4 mana. I honestly didn't think they would print a new 4 mana Wrath card for standard, but apparently they went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, we had such a good run without having a 4 mana cost Wrath for some time now, but I guess it was time to once again say goodbye to creature decks early on, at least like winning creatures. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. The card is really good. If you play control deck, you want at least 3 copies. Obviously, this card allowed control decks to go to Esper colors and go away from red that control decks were running before Ravnica allegiances. Mainly because the, what is it even called? The 5 mana Wrath spell was a bit slow, so you had to move to red in order to have the Deafening Clarion. But now when you have the new Wrath card, well, there's no reason to stick to red anymore. Anyway, if you play control, 3 copies of this in main board, 1 copy in the sideboard, and that's all the praise I can give the card. It is not really a question. You have to have this if you play control deck, or eventually you will start losing to aggressive creature decks. Let's move on to a card that you can skip, and that is the Karlov, legendary creature human. I've never seen this played even once. I don't know. I'm just gonna say no, this is a card that, well, it could be fun, but it's probably not that playable. It's a bit too expensive, and the thing is, cards can look good, but then you have to figure out what does it share cost with. What could I play instead for 4 mana? Could I play an Angel? Could I play a Wrath? Could I play blah 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 blah? And that is why you have, that is how you like evaluate cards. Like, the card might seem good, then you check what else is out there, then you realize the card might be good, but there's something much better for the same mana cost, so why would I include this? Anyway, let's move on to another card that's like, this is just a bit of fun. Obviously, in limited, this works really well, but in constructed, you never want to have the ethereal absolution. It's a buffer, it makes +1/+1, and your opponent get -1/-1. There's not much to say about it. Sadly, I already had 3 copies, but that means that eventually I won't be able to draw any more copies because of the new 5th card protection, so yay, I guess. Let's move on to Bedek and Bedazzle. This card is kind of weird. This is a card you can safely skip. It's a bit, I mean, it gives -3 for 2 mana, but you could have Moment of Craving instead, and that only costs you a common wild card, so there's no reason really to own this card. And of course, the secondary effect, or the second choice, is way too expensive for what it does. Now, Bed Evil is a card that looks promising, has seen play, but isn't really, it's not taking the world, I don't know how to describe it. The card looks good, it should fit the format, but it hasn't really seen that much play. People have tried it. This is one of those cards I just can't tell you about, because on the surface it looks so good, but for some reason it's not quite sticking. I don't know why. I'm just gonna leave it at that. It's a card where you have to make a choice if you want to include it or not. It's not a bad card, but the performance so far hasn't really seen what you expect out of the card. Not like Judith, the Scourge Diva. This card is amazing if you're playing creature and you're playing black and red. Obviously you need 4 copies of this card. It is amazing. It's an amazing aggro card. The effect is amazing, and it's one of those cards where you question whoever designed it and you question whoever okayed it to be released. Let's move on to something that is equally good, and that is the Theater of Horrors. Now, Theater of Horrors is maybe not a mainboard card, and it's not the 4 copy, but it is a really good sideboard card, and if you can get it stick, it can quite easily take over the game. It's basically another version of Experimental Frenzy, but a bit cheaper, with a bit different function, but essentially it is pretty much an Experimental Frenzy in another format. Not format, in another form, excuse me. But yeah, I'm not gonna say too much about it. The card is good, go ahead and craft it if you want to. Let's move on to Cinder Wines. Now, Cinder Wines is actually really good. This is mainly a sideboard card, but if you get this to stick against a controlled player or controlled deck, then this is amazing. Most control decks have a problem with this card. It's very hard to deal with. If it's on the board, the only thing that the majority of control decks can do is a single copy of Blink of an Eye they usually run, and Teferi. There's usually nothing else in a control deck that allows them to deal with enchantments. Now, maybe with Cinderwine becoming more meta, because it is slowly creeping up, that was really forced, then we might see more enchantment destruction in the sideboard of control decks. But for now, this card is actually really good. Obviously, if they use Teferi to get rid of this card, then they leave Teferi open on the next turn, assuming it's turn 5 and Teferi just came on the board. But yeah, this is a card you want to probably own, but it is a bit more suited for best of 3s. I wouldn't craft this if I only played best of 1s. Anyway, let's move on. Now, Trash and Threat. This card is playable. Well, I saw a list of someone getting, what was it? What is it even called in this game? It is called Mythic Rank, and he was running Trash and Threat. I've seen it in a couple of other lists as well. The card is really good. It obviously helps you to deal with like drakes, because you can have your things go after the drakes, and in case you actually have the mana open, then you can go ahead and create a 4/4 beast creature token with trample. It's not a bad card. Obviously, it is more for if you're playing green and red creature deck, maybe with a splash of black. One day, Jund will return. One day. Oh, how I miss you, Jund. And I miss you too, Wolfram Ramp. Sad times. Anyway, let's move on to Gruul Spellbreaker. Obviously, this is another one of those cards that are amazing. And if you're playing creature deck that has green and red, this is a card you really want to own. And you want to own all 4 copies of it, together with the uncommon goblin thingy that also has Raito. There's not much to say about this card. It is amazing. Obviously for creature decks that using the colors, but yeah, I can't give it higher praise than that. The card is really good. Let's move on to a card that is not so good, and that is the Domris Nodorog. I have no idea. 5/2. You may search your library and graveyard for the City Smasher. However, the City Smasher is worse than the other version of Dom. So yeah, this is a card that you can be quite upset opening. Luckily, I have avoided it for now, but yeah, this is a card you probably don't want to own. The same can be said about the Old Ways. Again, too expensive, too slow, and well, yeah, that's about it. And it's really awkward. You can't cast non-creature spells, sure, but most of the creatures that you do want to cast don't cost more than 6 mana or 5 mana, so why would you include this in a deck? It just seems to hampering you, and it's a card that you will be quite unhappy opening, I would say. Let's move on to a card that, well, it hasn't seen like tier 1 standard play, but it's certainly a fun deck, and that is the Biomancer's Familiar. Obviously, it helps adapting, and it's a really fun card. Now, as I said earlier, adapting as a tribe doesn't really work in a tier 1 environment, but if you're just playing casual queue and for fun, then there's nothing wrong with having a deck of adapt. Just don't expect to take it into ranked and do that well with it. It's a bit too hard to make it work. But it's not a card. Okay, it's if you're a competitive player that only cares about ranking and ranking is all you know, and that's all you know, sure, you'll be unhappy opening this card. If you're a normal to casual player, then there's nothing wrong with opening this card. You will be content. Let's move on to a interesting card. Now, this card is good. However, you need to understand what target, activated or trigger ability means and what it means to counter them. It's not the card that is currently seeing tier 1 play, but it's a card that I can see being used in tier 1 decks at some point. However, for the average player, understanding this card or the first part of the card is quite tricky. And I'm not gonna go into it right now because the video will be far too long. But the card is really, it is good, but it has very specific use. Obviously, it is a sideboard card. Unless you play something that wants token, then it's just a fun card. So let's move on to the Ascendancy. Obviously, this is the final tribe card for the Adapt deck. Fun card, usable card, not tier 1, more for the casual to non-competitive player. Up to you if you like it or not, but the card is not bad. It's not a catastrophe, and unless you're like a die-hard tier 1 player, you won't really be unhappy seeing this card. A card that you might be unhappy about seeing is this Utopian Speaker. It's a merfolk. If you like merfolk, sure, you could use this card, but otherwise the card is like, it's a bit all over the place. Anyway, let's finish off this video before it gets far too long. So let's have a look at the class of the Gruul pack. Now, this card is basically it is sharing a cost with too many cards that you want to play on turn 2, and the effect, while it seems good at first, that too many cards that are just more useful. And like, let's say you play a creature turn 2 or play this on turn 3, then you spend a turn with a single creature that is buffed that can easily be removed. I can't recommend the card, and I don't know. In limited maybe, but in constructed not really. I don't know. I had a phone call, so I kinda lost track of everything, so yeah. Luckily we're almost done, and the remaining cards are not too much to talk about. Like the Tomb of the Gruul pack, way too expensive. Sure, you get to draw a card when you play a multicolored spell, but for 5 mana, way too expensive. You could play this, or you could play Teferi, or you could play a couple of other planeswalkers. My mind is kind of got complete off track, so yeah. You see the point. Just too expensive, and it shares cost with too many useful cards. Right, so we're gonna finish this off really quickly. We have the dual lands. Obviously, you should own 4 copies of every single one, depending on what deck you want to play, assuming you play more than one color. What else can I say? You do need dual lands to make your deck the best it can be. But before I go, I also want to have a look at the Plaza of Harmony. Obviously, this is a stable card in gate decks, just because you do get the life, and it stabilizes you, it prolongs the game, it does amazing things. If you're playing any type of gate decks, you want 4 copies of this land, and that's all there is to say about it. Outside of gate decks, obviously this card is not very useful at all. But that is gonna finish off this video, and I did have a look at the time, and this is gonna be a pain to edit. So I will see you guys tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed this, I was gonna say shortish video, but it turned out to be quite long. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day, and as always, I am Project, and I catch you guys later.